So in this tutorial, we'll be looking at government-led action. And in the syllabus, they refer to government-led adaptation and mitigation strategies for global climate change. And I'm going to break this up into a series of videos. And this first one is going to deal with the conferences. Now, there's a whole history of different global conferences led through the UN and their COP conferences, informed by the International Panel for Climate Change. That's the big scientific body that work with and for the UN. That kind of informs the policies that come out of the conferences. But if we're looking at that period of 1997 to 2016, that takes us from the Kyoto Protocol to the Paris Agreement. And we can largely view that period of time as a time of government disagreement and failure of global governance. Very little was achieved through any of the conferences in that period of time. Now, the Kyoto Protocol, as you probably already know, was established in 1997. It only came into force in 2005. And this legally bound countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And that was kind of a key problem with it, the fact that things were legally bound, cuts were legally bound. Only 36 states fully participated in this. So it was largely considered a kind of a failure. A few regions kept their legally bound targets for CO2 emission reduction. Some success stories came out of the EU, and mainly Eastern European states achieved their targets. It's thought really that it was undermined by the US withdrawal. Obviously, the US is a global power, the world superpower. It has a massive role in terms of political leadership and geopolitical importance. And with the US withdrawal, it set the kind of the wrong example for many other countries, and so many other countries followed suit. The big stumbling block for the USA was the exclusion of the newly emerging economies. There was no requirement for countries like China, Brazil, and India to cut their own emissions. And so, these were rapidly growing economies, and they were producing, a lot of emissions. And so their exclusion was seen as unfair. Now, later climate change conferences were characterized by disagreement between certain countries and regional disagreements. It's generally thought that nations, and they still do this, they prioritize their own economic interests ahead of climate change and mitigation. And squabbles and disagreements occurred across different camps, so developed country regions and developing countries, the newly emerging economies. So countries were fundamentally reluctant to adopt legally bound emission cuts. Now, the Paris Agreement was seen as a watershed moment, with countries agreeing to set non-legally binding, nationally set targets to reduce their emissions. There was agreement that the global community should keep climate change below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is in the text. And in addition to that, to provide a green climate fund for adaptive capacity to developing countries. It's generally thought that developing countries will suffer the most of the impacts and they're most exposed and they're most vulnerable. And so there's a need for investment in their infrastructure for adaptive capacity. It's a staggering number, $100 billion a year starting in 2020 and running to 2025. The actual funding mechanisms for that 100 billion are supposed to be private and public payments, but it's very, very unclear where that money will actually come from. But of course, there are major concerns with this Paris Agreement. The US withdrawal under Donald Trump's administration has totally undermined the agreement and the national efforts. There seems to be a real lack of transparency or obligation on countries to fulfill and communicate their cuts. Remember, this is not legally binding and they are set nationally. So there's a real kind of lack of transparency around how that's done and how that's communicated and measured. So up to now, being 2020, very little has actually been achieved. Efforts are falling short of the 2 degree target. And while CO2 emissions continue to rise globally, not fall. So by 2020, only $10 billion has been pledged for that Green Development Fund, that's that Green Climate Fund. And so again, the mechanism for how that money will be generated remains very unclear. We've seen falls in carbon emissions this year in 2020 due to the pandemic, but that's just because of the economic fallout. And so actually, really in the long term, with the economic costs of the pandemic, it's just another stumbling block in terms of actually where money will be raised for the Green Climate Fund and how countries will invest in mitigation strategies. So there's a whole geopolitical area to this discussion. And I've tried to cover the main kind of discussion threads that you would want to develop through that.